Hello, everybody. Welcome to a series of dialogues on global history. I'm Haneda Masashi, and today we will discuss on a very interesting issue, on gender in global history. For this purpose, we have a very promising young researcher, Dr. Lisa Hellman, who is now a research leader at Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies at Bonn University. And she will move to Sweden. Originally she's from Sweden, and she will move to Sweden Lund University in 2021. And she spent a couple of times in Japan. First, for the first time, 2014, and for the second time, for a whole year between 2016 and 17. And she was with me at the University of Tokyo, and we had a lot of very interesting communications. And she got her PhD in Stockholm University, and the title of her doctoral thesis is Navigating the Foreign Quarters, which was published in 2018. Lisa, could you show the book, a copy of your book? Yeah, that one. That one was published in 2018 from Brill publisher. And in that book, she discussed a lot about the masculinity of Swedish East India Company's employees in Guangzhou in China. And with me from Tokyo College, Assistant Professor SHAKUTO Shiori, who is an anthropologist interested in gender aspect. So we have two very young, junior, but promising researchers working in the field of gender studies today. And they will discuss a lot about the relation between gender and global history. So let's start the discussion. Shiori, please.
Hey, hello, Lisa. It's so nice to meet you. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to learn from you about the intersection between global history and gender. So I heard that you've been working at the intersections of gender and global history by looking at, for instance, the employees of Swedish East India Company. How do you define global history in your research?
Wow, we just jump right in. That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. Well, I guess I sort of use both legs of global history. That is, I use both comparisons and connections. On the one hand, I've been working with comparative projects where you take different regions and then you do a very conscious comparison of them without letting any one region become the blueprint or the right answer. So in that way, I've been comparing Canton and Nagasaki, or I've been involved in projects comparing West Africa and Central Asia, or for that matter, Russian-Chinese diplomatic relations versus Spanish-Japanese diplomatic relations. But at heart, I think I'm an entangled history person. I think really it's this focus on interactions between separate world regions. Interactions that, of course, need to be meaningful, they need to be recurrent, they need to have a lasting impact, to borrow Osterhammer's definition. To me, these are the interactions that drive history forward. And to me, that would also be the sort of core of global history. Or if you would put it another way, all human beings live on the same planet, and we have done so for a very long time.
Yeah, that's a fascinating answer. So you're really highlighting two things about global history. One is comparison, which almost seems to assume that there are differences, therefore we can compare. But then at the same time, global history in your definition is all entangled. So it's also about the connections. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think that leads me to ask you the second questions that I had for you, which is the scalability in your analysis. So I think in your 2014 article entitled Using China at Home, you made this wonderful analysis comparing how the colonial production, the production of colonial knowledge about China was linked to the production of masculinities among the employees of East India Company. I wonder if you can elaborate more about these connections and entanglement between two different scales. On one hand, you have national level of colonial knowledge production. On the other hand, you also have the production of masculinity at the individual level. I wonder if you can elaborate on that connections and then maybe even scale it further up to talk about the scale of global history. What story does these connections between scales tell us about global history? Sorry, that was a big question.
Briefly.
It is yeah, briefly, of course. I mean, it is a big question, and it's also not in a sense, because I think, I mean, this sort of scaling is really at the heart of what we do in global history. And I think gender analysis can be really fruitful to illustrate this sort of scaling, even though it's not actually that common. Because the way I see it, global links are always in the micro. I mean, they happen in local interactions between individuals. And any such link, any such human interaction is intertwined with the making of gender. When you interact with someone else, either by connecting yourself to it, by highlighting similarities, or by really showing difference and distancing yourself from this person, you are also making yourself. In the same way, when you create an empire, of course, that presupposes some sort of collective making of something, be it rituals, be it legal practices, whatever it may be it discourses. When then representatives of empires meet, or for that matter, representative of an empire and a region and a person from a region they want to dominate, then every step, when you use discourses, when you establish institutions, when you establish everyday practices, would be related to the discourses, institutions, and practice of that other person and that other region. So to me, it's really intertwined with the very making of empire. And in that sense, on the global scale, the creation of empire, the interaction between polities, or for that matter, interactions between individuals, it all comes with a sort of inbuilt gendered shadow, so to speak. So when we as global historians look at the power dynamics of regional connections, they can never be gender neutral. In a sense, I think this is part of the power that drives the global connections.
That's so fascinating. So are you saying that the process of empire building is a gendered process as well?
Oh, definitely. I would certainly say so. And there I'm really not just making that up. I think it's also quite strongly established in classical imperial history, but also especially in that connects to post-colonial theory. What's so interesting about the Chinese and the Japanese example, I think, is though that in the classical post-colonial theory, you use empires where you have a European dominant empire that dominate a region outside of Europe. Well, pre-modern China is not dominated by Europe, nor is pre-modern Japan. So instead, in these sort of classical arenas like travel writings or proto-scientific writing, instead of having this discourse about the weak and feminine man, you use another masculinity discourse that exists in parallel, which is the blackguard, the evil tyrant who's dominating these poor, subservient women. And so there, I think it's always part of empire making, but it can take very different forms.
Are you saying that the process of empire building, say, for example, in Japan and China, was quite different to, say, the process of empire making that took place in Europe? And are you then also saying that although both processes are gendered, they were gendered in a different way?
No, I guess I would rather say the opposite. I would say that they are very similar. When one looks at, for example, the Japanese empire in Taiwan and the relationship to Taiwanese indigenous people, where a scholar called Juling Lee has done fantastic work also on how they are portrayed, their bodies portrayed, how their nakedness is portrayed. That's actually very similar to what we see in European empire building practices. I guess the difference I wanted to stress was that when Europeans are in a dominant position, they use one discourse. But when they have nothing to, when they just have to obey, they use a very different discourse.
So it's a question of narratives, no?
Definitely. And when you are in a position to dominate, you want to present one narrative. But when you are in a position where suddenly you are the dominated person, you, of course, present a completely different story. So I'm not saying anything about the actual gender practices of this time. I'm only talking about the narratives about them.
Right, the gendered narratives. That's fascinating. I love to hear examples. And also, this leads me to another question that I had for you, which was, if the process of empire building is a very gendered process in terms of discourse, in actual practice too, I would assume that a lot of historical documents you can find from colonial archive, etc., are often kept by men or written by men for other men, and in forms that would have been only accessible to men at the time. So if you want to dig histories from, say, for example, women's perspective, people who were subservient at that time, how do global historians, in a way, find women?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, it is a challenge. On one hand, one can say that it's very present because there's also this extreme preoccupation in a lot of empire building about family making, about who beds and weds whom, and what do we do with children in mixed marriages. And there's a lot of worry and concern about these issues. So in one hand, there's a lot of records produced. Of course, as you say, these would not necessarily be the voices of subservient people that are recorded that or are writing. But then again, that's the same for a lot of history. I mean, we rarely get records from servants, from slaves. We rarely get records about things that were perceived as shameful or just sort of things that were taken for granted. What do you eat for breakfast? How do you take a shower? These things are not necessarily mentioned very much. So I think to sort of tease out traces of gender relations, of masculinities, of femininities in sources that have nothing officially to do about that, I mean, that's just part of the classic historian's craft.
Would you say, are there any historical records that you have found which seemed unrelated to gender relations, but turn out to be all about that?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think a little bit. Well, I mean, I guess in a sense, yes. For example, when I think about certain import records, how you import, what sort of things you choose to import to Europe. And of course, at first I would go like, oh, this is just a shopping list. But then when I went into personal letters, I also realized that a lot of these shopping lists are arranged also by wives at home, by sisters at home, by mothers at home. And actually, they are very much part in even arranging this entire global flow of commodities. So in that sense, it's also a sort of say a female organization also motoring. I don't know if that was the best example. You put me on the spot there a little bit. I'll see if I can come up with another one.
Example, I thought, often we think of the global circulation of commodity or economic relations as belonging to the domain of public life. But actually, that's organized by women who are not necessarily in the public domain. So finding women through such import lists, I think, is very masterful.
And also particularly because, I mean, this is one of my pet peeves when it comes to global history, that one of the classic connections that we follow, one of the classic flows is that it is trade connections, that it's economic flows. But first of all, such flows are also part of gender dynamic, but also the fact that other fields in, for example, gender history has been quite good at adopting a global perspective. But global history has not been fantastic at adopting a gender perspective. Right. I mean, Patrick Manning complained about this in 2003, and then Marie Wiesner-Hank did the same in 2015, and Maria Sjöberg, I think, in 2016, and we're just very slow here. It's time to get to work.
Well, perhaps maybe we can conclude by, I would invite you to tell us what kind of story does a focus on gender, what new insights does the focus on gender give to the study of global history? Why is gender so important?
I think it has an immense potential, partly because global history has been sometimes criticized because it privileges smooth connections, not disrupted connections or questions about unequal power. Well, gender history is all about power. And on the other hand, I think particularly in the field actually of global microhistory or global biographies, then we can see how women's history in the 70s used biographies to sort of present completely different narratives, other actors to sort of disrupt these faulty macro narratives. And then now, I think we have the chance with global biographies to do the same. By choosing who we put at the center, we can actually sort of disrupt new macro narratives and present completely different angles and different truths. And I think that is also something that is the job for a global historian.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Tell us your most recent work for that issue.
Oh, well, right now,
very briefly. Yeah.
Very briefly, I'm working on the story of a Swedish woman who gets captive by Russians and who is then taken to Central Asia, where she is enslaved, where she gradually finds a new life at court and eventually even manages to buy some slaves of her own before making it back to Sweden after 20 years. This is a story absolutely stuffed with global entanglements of knowledge circulation, of economics, of the very process of empire connection and globalization. And it's all intertwined with the things that she has to do or can do because she is a woman.
Mm-hmm. We look forward to reading that text. Will it be a book or an article?
It will be an article, and eventually she and all her compatriots will become a book.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lisa, today. And we look forward to welcoming you once again at Tokyo College or at the University of Tokyo in the very near future. Thank you for both.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
See you.
Very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.